The morning sunlight spilled gently through the windows of the small cafe. It was quiet at first, the kind of calm that makes the world feel paused for a moment. Outside, people hurried along the streets, their faces focused on errands, work, and routines. Inside, the cafe had a few scattered patrons. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the rich aroma of coffee. The young woman pushed the door open slowly and stepped in, her eyes scanning the room. She held a small bag tightly against her chest. It was worn, the fabric faded from use, but it held all she had with her. Hunger gnawed quietly in her stomach, but she tried to ignore it. Asking for help had never been easy, and she had learned the hard way that some people were quick to judge. She had saved a little money to get something simple, maybe a cup of soup or a piece of bread. But even that felt like too much to ask in this moment. Her eyes moved across the cafe, resting on the wooden tables and chairs, each marked with tiny scratches and stains from years of use. She noticed a man reading a newspaper in the corner, a couple chatting quietly at another table, and the barista behind the counter, busy preparing orders. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. But she knew that her presence might not be seen that way. Summoning her courage, she walked toward the counter. Her steps were hesitant, almost shy. She cleared her throat softly, hoping to speak without drawing too much attention. "Excuse me?" she began, her voice low but polite. "Could I, maybe?" "Get a small meal. I don't have much money," she trailed off embarrassed, feeling the weight of her request like a spotlight on her. She tried not to look up, fearing the judgment she had experienced so often before. But then she heard it. A group of people sitting near the back of the cafe had noticed her. One of them laughed quietly, and then another, and soon it became a ripple of mocking whispers and giggles. "Did you hear that? She's asking for food like it's some kind of joke," one said, smirking. "She looks like she hasn't eaten in days." Another added, their tone heavy with ridicule. The young woman froze. Her face burned with shame, but she did not retreat. She had faced this before, many times in her life, and she had learned that losing composure only made people bolder in their cruelty. She tried to smile politely, though it felt fragile and small. I just, she whispered, but her words faded as the laughter grew louder. Some of the other patrons glanced over, curious, while others quickly looked away. It's uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The barista behind the counter noticed the situation and hesitated. He had seen people treated unfairly before, but he was busy with other customers. The young woman could sense his hesitation, but she did not want to ask for help in a way that would make anyone feel pressured. She had learned to rely on herself. Even when the world seemed unkind, the group mocking her continued, their whispers sharp and cutting. "Can't she just go somewhere else?" "This is ridiculous," one said, shaking their head. She swallowed hard, feeling the lump in her throat. Hunger pressed at her, but she also felt something else, a quiet determination. She would not let their laughter define her. She had something within her that they could not see, a strength hidden under the surface, waiting for the right moment. She stepped back slightly, moving toward an empty corner of the cafe. Her fingers brushed against the fabric of her bag, and she felt the familiar comfort of carrying her small belongings close. She did not know what to do next, but she knew she needed a moment to think, to gather herself, as she moved. Her eyes caught sight of something she had overlooked when she first entered. In the far corner, there was a piano. It was old, its wood, slightly worn and faded, but it looked cared for, loved perhaps by those who had played it before. The keys, though slightly yellowed with age, gleamed under the sunlight that fell through the window. Something inside her stirred at the sight. It was almost like the piano had been waiting for her, calling softly in a language only she could understand. She had played before, quietly, in places where no one was watching. Music had always been a sanctuary for her, a place where she could express herself without words, without fear. Her hands itched to touch the keys. She felt a pull, a need to do something beyond standing in the corner and enduring the laughter. She did not yet know how the cafe would react, but she felt that if she could play, even just a simple melody, she could reclaim a small piece of her dignity. The group who had mocked her now seemed distracted, laughing among themselves, oblivious to the young woman's growing resolve. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. Her stomach still ached with hunger, and her cheeks burned with embarrassment. But her mind focused on the piano. She stepped closer, each movement careful and deliberate. Her fingers hovered above the keys, trembling slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet in the cafe wrap around her. She imagined the notes flowing from her hands, simple and pure. A story told without words. The first touch of her fingers against the keys sent a shiver through her. The sound was soft, delicate, almost hesitant, but it was hers. She opened her eyes and looked at the group who had mocked her, who had thought her presence was a joke. They were still talking, still smirking, expecting nothing remarkable. And then she played another note. And another. The young woman began with a simple melody, something she had practiced countless times in the privacy of her small room at home. It was not complex, but it carried emotion, hope, sorrow, strength, and a quiet defiance. She could feel the music flowing through her, each note grounding her, giving her courage she had thought was lost. Slowly, she allowed herself to lose some of the fear that had held her back. Her hands moved more confidently across the keys. The melody grew richer, more confident, filling the corners of the cafe with sound that was impossible to ignore. The group who had laughed before paused mid-sentence. Their smirks faltered as the music reached their ears. It was beautiful, unexpected, and unlike anything they had anticipated. The cafe itself seemed to lean in, attentive. As if the walls themselves were listening, other patrons turned their heads, curious now. The man with the newspaper set it aside. A couple chatting quietly stopped mid-conversation. Even the barista paused, momentarily forgetting the orders he had been preparing. The young woman's heart raced, not from fear, but from the exhilaration of being heard in a way that words could never achieve. For the first time that morning, she felt a spark of pride, a quiet joy that no amount of mockery could take away. She played with all the emotion she had carried silently for so long. Every note was a statement, every chord a small declaration that she was not to be underestimated, not to be dismissed. The mocking laughter had vanished, replaced by something entirely different, attention, awe, and a sudden realization among those who had judged her so quickly. In that moment, the cafe transformed. It was no longer a place where she felt small and powerless. It had become a stage, a place where her voice could be heard through her music. And though she was still hungry, though her stomach still ached, she felt full in a way that nothing else could provide. The young woman did not stop. She did not glance around to see reactions or seek approval. She played because she needed to, because it was who she was, and because it reminded her that her worth was never determined by the opinions of those who could not see beyond the surface. And as her music filled the room, she realized something profound. She was not just a girl asking for food. She was someone with a gift, someone who could command attention, respect, and even awe without ever raising her voice. She had been mocked, yes, but in that very moment, she was untouchable, strong, and alive. The first part of her journey in that cafe had begun. It was a journey from shame to courage, from hunger to expression, from being seen as less than to being recognized, even if only through the simple, powerful language of music. She finished. Her first melody, her hands hovering above the keys for a brief moment, catching her breath. The room remained quiet, every ear attuned to the sound that had just filled the space. And for the first time that morning, she allowed herself a small, private smile, knowing that something had shifted not just within her, but in the way the world around her had to acknowledge her presence. Her story was only beginning, but the first notes had been played. The cafe would never feel quite the same again. The young woman's fingers lingered on the keys for a moment, feeling the cool surface beneath them. The piano, once just a piece of furniture in the corner, had become her connection to something bigger than the cafe, bigger than the people who had mocked her just moments before. She took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of the cafe mix with the faint echoes of her first tentative notes. At first, she was unsure of what to play. Mind was crowded with fear and uncertainty. The mocking laughter was still somewhere, in the air, like a shadow she could not shake completely. But then, instinctively, she began with something simple, a melody she had composed in her own room late at night when no one was around. The sound started soft, almost hesitant, a whisper of music floating gently through the room. Her hands moved. Slowly at first, testing the keys, feeling the weight of the notes, and then, as if the piano itself understood her, the music began to flow more freely. Each note carried her emotions, her frustration, her quiet anger at being judged, and her longing for a place where she could be seen for who she really was. The patrons in the cafe started noticing the change. The man reading a newspaper put it down, his eyes drawn to the corner where she sat. The couple chatting quietly stopped mid-sentence, listening. Even the barista paused his work, unsure whether he should intervene or simply watch. The group who had mocked her initially froze. Their smirks faded as the first few chords reached their ears. It was not loud or showy music, but there was a depth in it that could not be ignored. One of them whispered, "Is she really playing that?" Another shook their head, a mixture of disbelief and unease crossing their face. The young woman did not look at them. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her. She had spent years playing in private, letting the piano become her voice when the world refused to listen. Now, she realized, the world was finally paying attention. And it felt both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently. She began to explore the full range of the piano, from the deep, resonant bass notes to the high, delicate treble. Each note seemed to reach into the hearts of those listening, drawing them closer to the emotions she had poured into every melody she had ever played. A few patrons leaned forward in their seats, captivated. The young woman's music had transformed the room. It was as if the laughter, the mockery, and even the daily chatter had melted away, leaving only her and the piano. For the first time, she felt the power of her talent not in terms of fame or recognition, but in the quiet command it held over the space around her. The group that had mocked her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them tried to speak, but no words came. They had expected failure, expected her to falter, to confirm their assumptions about her. Instead, they were confronted with something raw and unexpected, something that made them realize how wrong they had been. She did not rush. She let each note linger, giving it time to resonate, to breathe. The cafe, once a place of casual chatter, had become a hall of silent attention. Even the other staff members who had been moving about stopped, standing still to listen. Her music changed subtly as she continued. She moved from the gentle, hesitant notes of her first melody into something more expressive, more emotional. There were moments of sadness, hints of the struggles she had endured, and moments of hope, glimmers of the strength she had found within herself. The contrasts painted a story that could be understood by anyone, regardless of their own experiences. At one point, a small group of children entered the cafe, curious about the sound. They paused by the doorway, wide-eyed, and one of them whispered, "To their parent, who is playing that?" Their innocence and wonder made her smile faintly, even without opening her eyes. She realized that her music had reached them too, crossing age and background. Speaking directly to their hearts, the young woman's confidence grew with each passing moment. She no longer hesitated, no longer worried about judgment. The piano had become an extension of herself, a channel through which she could express everything she had felt, but could never say. She started to experiment with dynamics, letting her hands move more freely, exploring the emotional depth of the instrument. There were moments of quiet, almost fragile beauty, followed by powerful sweeping notes that filled every corner of the cafe. Patrons who had come in for a simple breakfast or coffee found themselves caught in a world entirely different from the ordinary one outside. The man who had been reading the newspaper finally spoke, unable to contain his admiration. I didn't expect this," he said softly, to no one in particular. "She's incredible." The couple who had been chatting nodded in agreement, their faces showing genuine awe. The group who had mocked her remained silent, their earlier arrogance replaced with an awkward awareness. They could no longer dismiss her. Every glance, every note, reminded them that assumptions based on appearances were dangerous and unfair. They had seen her as someone weak, someone to laugh at, and now they were forced to confront the truth of her talent. The young woman felt a surge of emotion, but did not let it distract her from her playing. She focused on the story she wanted to tell through her music, the story of a girl who had faced mockery, hunger, and fear, yet still found a way to rise, to create. To command respect without speaking a single word, she moved into a new section of her melody, one she had improvised on the spot. Her hands moved faster now, dancing across the keys with a grace that belied the anxiety she had felt just moments before. Each note seemed to carry its own weight, telling a story of resilience, courage, and quiet triumph. The cafe itself seemed to respond. The clinking of cups and cutlery had stopped. Conversations had ceased. All attention was on her, and she reveled in it silently, not for vanity, but because it felt like justice in its own quiet way. She had been mocked for asking something, as simple as food, and now she was speaking to the hearts of everyone present through the one thing that truly belonged to her. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours as she poured herself into her music. She was aware of every eye on her, every expression, every subtle shift in the room. The young woman realized that her playing was doing more than filling the space with sound. It was changing it, transforming the energy of everyone present. The barista, who had been hesitant at first, now watched with admiration. He had seen people who thought themselves important or clever mock others before, but he had never witnessed someone respond with such quiet power. He realized that her music was not just entertainment. It was a statement, a reminder that talent and dignity cannot be measured by appearances. The group who had mocked her finally exchanged glances. Their confidence had been shattered, replaced by a sudden, uncomfortable respect. One of them shifted in their seat and muttered under their breath, "We misjudged her." The words were almost inaudible, but they were enough. She did not stop to acknowledge them. She did not need to. The music itself spoke louder than any apology could. She began to slow down slightly, letting the final notes of this section linger. They hung in the air like a gentle echo, softening the tension in the room, leaving a sense of calm and reflection. The young woman's chest rose and fell as she caught her breath, her hands still hovering above the keys. She felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of having reclaimed a piece of herself that had been ignored or dismissed for too long. A few patrons approached her cautiously. One handed her a small cup of coffee, another offered a plate with a simple breakfast. He did not need to speak words of apology. Their gestures were enough to show respect and appreciation. She nodded gently, a faint smile touching her lips, and accepted the offerings without a word, letting her music continue to communicate what she could not express verbally. The young woman knew this was only the beginning. She had discovered the power she held when she refused to be silenced. The piano had given her a voice in a place that had tried to diminish her. And now, she understood that her music could reach further than the confines of that small cafe. It could touch anyone willing to listen, anyone willing to see beyond first impressions. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of belonging, even if it was temporary. She realized that her talent, her determination, and her courage were forces that could not be ignored. The mocking laughter that had greeted her entry now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of those who had witnessed her strength. As she finished this part of her melody, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys. The notes faded into the soft background hum of the cafe, leaving behind a feeling of awe and reflection. She knew that more challenges would come, but she also knew that she could face them with the same quiet courage that had brought her to this moment. The young woman looked around the cafe, her eyes meeting those of the patrons who had once mocked her. There was no need for words. Her music had spoken for her, conveying every feeling, every struggle, every triumph. But in that unspoken exchange, she felt a sense of triumph that no ridicule could ever take away. Her journey had only just begun, but she had already learned a powerful lesson. That talent, patience, and courage could transform even the most humiliating situations into moments of dignity and respect. And as she prepared to continue playing, she knew that every note she struck would carry that lesson forward, for herself and for everyone willing to listen. The young woman's fingers moved effortlessly across the piano keys, each note carrying a confidence and depth she had never felt in public before. The cafe, once filled with chatter and laughter, had fallen silent. Even the faint clatter of Dishes seemed to pause, as though the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for every note to find its place. She no longer played for herself alone. She played for everyone present, even for the people who had mocked her so harshly earlier. Her music began to grow bolder, exploring emotions she had kept hidden for years. There was sadness in it, yes. A deep sorrow born from hunger, shame, and loneliness. But there was also hope, a quiet, persistent hope that refused to be dimmed by anyone's judgment. Each note felt like a small act of defiance, a statement that she would not be ignored or belittled. The patrons watched, transfixed. The couple at one table sat leaning forward, their hands clasped together, eyes wide as if they were witnessing something magical. The man who had been reading a newspaper moments ago now rested his elbows on the table, his chin in his hands, listening intently. Every subtle pause, every swell of sound held their attention completely. Even the barista had stopped all movement. He had seen many people come and go, some timid, some bold. But he had never seen someone command a room with nothing but their music. He felt a mix of awe and disbelief, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized that he had underestimated the young woman just as much as the others had. The group who had mocked her earlier now sat rigid, their laughter replaced by silence. They could not look away, even if they wanted to. Something in the way she played, the honesty and emotion of each note, demanded attention. Their earlier assumptions crumbled with every chord, and a quiet, uncomfortable awareness began to settle over them. They had thought her meek, fragile, someone to ridicule. Now they were confronted with a strength that could not be denied. The young woman's hands glided over the keys, moving from gentle, reflective notes into richer, fuller chords. The music grew layered, intricate, yet unforced, like a story unfolding in real time. It was as if her fingers were telling a tale of struggle, resilience, and quiet triumph, a story anyone could understand, no matter who they were or where they came from. Outside, a soft breeze drifted in through the slightly open window. It carried the faint smell of morning, of fresh bread and dew, mixing with the aroma of coffee inside. The sounds of the street seemed to fade away, replaced entirely by her music. The young woman felt a connection to the world that was bigger than herself, yet intimately personal. Every note was a thread linking her to everyone in the room, drawing them closer, not through words, but through shared feeling. A small child in the cafe, perched on a chair at the edge of the room, stared wide-eyed at the young woman. The child's mother whispered something softly, but the child barely noticed, lost in the sound that seemed to fill their heart. The innocence of the child's attention reminded the young woman why she had started. Playing in the first place, not for praise, not for recognition, but for the ability to touch people. To communicate something that words could never capture, her music began to shift again. Moving from sorrowful notes to lighter, more playful ones, there was a delicate rhythm now, a gentle lifting of the mood. Patrons exchanged glances, some smiling, some nodding slightly in recognition of the story unfolding through the sound. She was no longer just a shy girl asking for food. She had become the center of attention in a way that no one could have predicted. Commanding respect without saying a single word, the group who had mocked her stirred slightly, uneasy. One whispered to another, I didn't expect this. She's amazing." The words were tentative, almost apologetic, yet even they could not hide the awe in their tone. Another simply shook their head, silent but clearly processing the reality they had overlooked. The young woman noticed none of this. She was lost in the music, each note a release of tension she had carried for far too long. Her stomach still ached, a subtle reminder of the hunger that had brought her here, but it no longer consumed her mind. For the first time, she felt fully present, fully alive, fully herself. As her fingers danced across the keys, she began to experiment with dynamics. Soft, lingering notes contrasted sharply with sudden, bold chords, creating tension and release in a way that mirrored the emotion she had held inside. She realized that the music could convey anger, sorrow, and hope all at once. And she embraced that power. Patrons who had been casual visitors were now leaning in, drawn to every sound. Some had tears in their eyes, moved by the depth of feeling she could express so effortlessly. A man quietly wiped at his cheek, and a woman whispered to her companion, She makes you feel things. Things you didn't expect." The young woman allowed herself a brief glance around the room. She saw respect forming in the eyes of those who had once laughed at her. She saw surprise and admiration, even in those who had assumed they knew her story without ever truly seeing her. And in that moment, she felt a quiet sense of triumph. Not loud, not boastful, but deeply satisfying. She had turned mockery into attention, embarrassment into admiration. All through the music that had always been her voice, her melody began to rise, flowing with confidence and grace. She layered harmonies, letting the piano resonate fully. Each chord seemed to fill the room with warmth, a feeling that touched every listener differently. The young woman felt it too, the connection with the people around her. A shared human experience that transcended words, money, or status. The group who had mocked her finally shifted uncomfortably. Their earlier sense of superiority had been replaced with humility. One of them, unable to contain curiosity, leaned slightly forward and whispered, How? How can someone like her play like that? Their tone was hesitant, tinged with the realization that they had been completely wrong in judging her. She did not respond. She did not need to. The music itself was her answer. Each note carried a weight of truth that no argument, no mockery, no whispered judgment could ever erase. She had always known her own worth. But now the world around her had begun to see it too, even if only in small, hesitant glimmers. A few more patrons quietly approached, offering small gestures, a cup of tea, a plate of food, a kind smile. She accepted with quiet grace, letting her hands continue their work. She had never asked for these gestures outright, and yet they were offered freely. A recognition of her talent and her dignity that felt more nourishing than any meal could. The young woman began to weave subtle changes into her melody, adding delicate trills and pauses that created a sense of storytelling within the music. There were moments of tension where the notes seemed uncertain, almost fragile, followed by moments of bold, sweeping chords that filled the room with emotion. It was as though the piano itself was alive, breathing, and carrying the weight of her experiences. Time seemed to slow. The young woman played for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. Every note, every pause, every chord was intentional. She did not think about the mocking group, nor the patrons who now watched with admiration. She played simply because it was who she was, and because for the first time, she could. The cafe, transformed by her music, felt like a different place entirely. It was no longer just a space for food and conversation. It was a sanctuary, a place where emotions could be shared openly, without judgment. Patrons, who had been strangers moments ago, now shared an invisible connection, linked by the music that flowed effortlessly from the young woman's hands. As the melody reached its climax, the young woman let her hands soar across the keys, powerful yet controlled. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, every listener captivated. The tension, the judgment, the mockery of earlier moments, all of it dissolved into the music. And for the first time, she felt entirely free, entirely present, entirely herself. Slowly, she began to bring the melody to a close. The final notes lingered in the air, soft and deliberate, as if giving the listeners time to absorb everything they had just experienced. She rested her hands lightly on the keys, her chest rising and falling, feeling the quiet aftermath of an experience that had transformed not just the room, but herself. The cafe remained silent for a heartbeat, the stillness almost reverent. Then, quietly, one patron whispered that was incredible. Another nodded, tears glimmering in their eyes. Even the group who had mocked her before shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence replaced by acknowledgement, awe, and a silent respect that could not be denied. The young woman smiled faintly, a small private victory. She had faced mockery, fear, and doubt, and had emerged stronger, not through words, but through the music that had always been her true voice. She knew that this was only part of her journey. that more challenges and obstacles lay ahead. But she also knew something vital, that her strength, her talent, and her courage were real, undeniable, and capable of changing the world around her in ways that others could not yet see. And as she closed her eyes and let the silence settle, she felt a profound sense of peace. The piano had given her a voice when she had none. It turned ridicule into attention, had transformed embarrassment into admiration. She had discovered the power that lay within her, a power that would carry her forward through whatever the future might hold. Her journey was only halfway complete, but the second part of her story of resilience, courage, and quiet triumph was already etched into the hearts of everyone who had listened. And in that moment, she knew that she would never again allow anyone to diminish her. Because her music, her true self, could not be silenced. The young woman's hands rested lightly on the piano keys for a brief moment, letting the last echo of her melody linger in the quiet of the cafe. The room remained still, as if everyone was caught in a moment suspended between sound and silence. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to breathe, feeling the vibrations of the music still humming through her fingertips. She could sense the subtle shifts in the energy around her. The laughter that had greeted her earlier had vanished completely, replaced by something entirely different. Respect, curiosity, and a quiet awe that filled the air. The group who had mocked her earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their earlier confidence, their careless arrogance, had been replaced by something heavier, an awareness that they had been wrong. The girl they had laughed at, the one they had assumed to be meek and helpless, had revealed a depth of talent and emotion that none of them had anticipated. For the first time, they were faced with the uncomfortable truth that appearances could deceive, that assumptions could be cruel, that underestimating someone could feel like a mistake they would never forget. One of them leaned back in their chair, attempting to mask their embarrassment, but it was futile. Every glance around the room reminded them of what they had missed: the smiles, the quiet tears, the nods of admiration from strangers who had never known her. They had believed themselves clever, amused by her presence, but now they felt the weight of their own misjudgment pressing down on them. The young woman, oblivious to their discomfort, began to play again. This time, her hands moved more deliberately, more assuredly. The first notes were soft, almost gentle, a way of inviting everyone in the cafe to listen closely, to feel the emotions she poured into every sound. Her melody carried a sense of calm, a reassurance that despite mockery and judgment, she would continue to express herself with grace. Her music shifted gradually, growing richer, more complex. She added layers of harmonies, subtle flourishes, that filled the room with emotion and depth. The patrons who had been watching quietly were now fully captivated. They could not look away. Every note seemed to tell a story, every pause a reflection of the struggles she had faced, the resilience she had cultivated, and the quiet strength she carried within herself. The man who had been reading a newspaper earlier now sat completely still, his eyes fixed on the young woman. He felt something stir within him, a mix of admiration and humility. He had assumed she was timid, unremarkable, someone to overlook. But now, hearing the music and seeing the confidence in her expression, he realized just how wrong he had been. The melody carried not just technical skill, but a story. A raw honesty that no words could capture. The couple who had been chatting quietly also watched in silence. Their earlier conversation forgotten, they leaned in slightly, their faces reflecting a mix of wonder and respect. The music touched them in ways they could not explain. It spoke of struggle, yes, but also of triumph, of courage, and of the beauty that could emerge when someone refused to be. Diminished by the judgment of others, the group who had mocked her shifted again. One of them whispered to another, almost inaudibly, I think we underestimated her." Their words carried a mix of shame and amazement. They had come in expecting to find someone weak or pitiful, someone whose mistakes they could quietly laugh at. Instead, they were confronted with talent, courage, and composure that shone brighter than anything they had expected. The young woman did not slow down. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keys, transitioning from soft, reflective notes to bold, commanding chords. The music was no longer just an expression of her own emotions. It had become a story for everyone in the cafe, a narrative of transformation and recognition. Each note demanded attention. Each chord resonated with clarity. And every pause carried the weight of the silence that had enveloped the room as she played. She could feel the tension in the group who had mocked her beginning to unravel. Their posture stiffened, their eyes avoided hers, and yet they could not stop listening. The music was impossible to ignore. It filled the space between them and demanded acknowledgement. They had mocked her out of assumption, but now they were confronted with undeniable reality. The young woman's talent, patience, and courage had shifted the balance in a way that words could never achieve. Outside, the sounds of the city faded into the background. The cafe had become a world unto itself, a space where judgment was transformed into reflection and mockery dissolved into admiration. Patrons who had come in for simple coffee or breakfast were now witnesses to something extraordinary, something that would stay with them long after the last note had faded. The young woman allowed herself a small smile, though her focus never wavered from the piano. She was aware of the energy in the room, of the shift in perception, and yet she played not for recognition, but because the music demanded to be heard. Every note was intentional, a delicate balance between technical skill and raw emotion. She could feel the story unfolding, the tension rising and resolving, and she let the music guide her hands. Her melody began to carry a sense of triumph. There were moments of quiet reflection, where the notes lingered and floated in the air, followed by powerful crescendos that filled every corner of the cafe. The patrons were mesmerized. The man who had earlier been reading now whispered softly to his companion, She is incredible." The couple nodded, unable to find the right words, their admiration clear in every gesture. The group, who had mocked her, felt a different kind of weight. Their earlier amusement had turned into discomfort, then realization, and now into a subtle, undeniable regret. They had judged too quickly, laughed too loudly, and assumed too much. The young woman's music had revealed a truth they could not ignore, that strength and talent often exist where they are least expected, and that cruelty can quickly become a source of shame when faced with authenticity. A few more patrons, emboldened by the atmosphere, approached with small gestures of kindness. One handed her a cup of tea, another placed a plate of food near her. She accepted each offering with quiet grace, nodding softly, letting her hands continue to weave their story across the keys. These gestures, simple as they were, carried the weight of acknowledgement. They were not pity, nor were they applause. They were recognition, quiet respect that spoke volumes. The young woman's music shifted once more. She began to explore subtle variations in tempo, dynamics, and tone, creating a sense of movement that mirrored the emotional journey of the room. The soft, tender passages spoke of vulnerability and past struggles, while the bold, sweeping chords expressed resilience and triumph. Patrons were drawn in completely, unable to look away, caught in the spell of the narrative unfolding in sound. The group who had mocked her tried to remain composed, but their discomfort was palpable. One of them whispered again, We shouldn't have laughed at her." Another nodded slightly, eyes cast downward, unable to meet hers. The young woman continued to play, not needing to acknowledge their change in attitude. The music itself was enough, a lesson delivered without words. A gentle, yet firm, reminder that judgment based on appearances is often misleading. The young woman began to slow the pace of her melody, letting the final notes stretch and fade, lingering like a gentle sigh in the air. She allowed herself to feel the energy in the room, the shift from mockery to admiration, from discomfort to awe. She had not just played music. She had transformed the atmosphere, reshaped perceptions, and reclaimed her own dignity in a space that had initially seemed hostile. The cafe remained quiet for a few moments after the final note. Then, softly, one patron whispered that it was beautiful. Another nodded, a smile spreading across their face. Even the group who had mocked her earlier shifted in their seats, a subtle acknowledgement of their error in judgment, their earlier arrogance replaced with respect. The young woman rested her hands lightly on the keys, breathing steadily. She did not need to speak or explain. The music had done everything for her. It had expressed what words could not, conveyed her emotions, and transformed the energy of the room. The experience left her feeling a quiet sense of triumph, a recognition that she had faced ridicule and emerged stronger, not through confrontation, but through the power of her talent and the honesty of her expression. She looked around, catching the eyes of several patrons who now regarded her with admiration. Some offered smiles, others nods, small gestures of acknowledgement that carried a profound weight. She smiled faintly in return, a gesture of gratitude and quiet pride. Her journey through this moment of mockery had not only reclaimed her dignity, but it also left a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. The young woman knew that life would continue to present challenges, that people would continue to make judgments, and that moments of embarrassment or hardship were inevitable. But she also knew that she possessed a strength that could not be taken away, a power to rise above mockery and transform even the harshest moments into opportunities for expression and connection. And in that moment, she allowed herself to feel fully alive. She had played through fear, doubt, and ridicule, and had emerged with her head held high, her talent acknowledged, and her spirit intact. The cafe, now transformed by her music and her courage, held a quiet energy that would linger long after she left, a reminder that authenticity, resilience, and grace could silence judgment more effectively than words ever could. The young woman took a final, deep breath, her fingers brushing lightly across the keys in a gentle, almost playful gesture. The music had done its work. She had turned mockery into respect, embarrassment into acknowledgement, and solitude into connection. And as she sat back, letting the last echoes of the piano fade, she felt a sense of peace, of quiet triumph, and of unshakable confidence that would carry